Now, how do you feel about this sign? Detour ahead. Oh boy, yeah, we don't particularly always like the detour ahead sign. We don't appreciate it. And you're saying, yeah, you rarely do you say, oh good, I get to go on a detour now to somewhere I don't know where I'm going to end up going. And, you just don't get excited about it. It's going to cost you time, it's going to cost you money, it's going to cost you pressure and anxieties that come along with it. Back in about 2004, we were teaching our oldest son how to drive, and he had just got his permit, and by this time he had about 20 hours of the 50 hours that are required for you to get a license in Illinois. And so we were heading from Chicago down to Joplin, and we thought it would be a good idea to give him some time to drive, because it's about an 8-hour drive, so he would get some more of his time. And so we put him in the car, and he started driving, and it was in the afternoon, and I did something that I probably shouldn't do whenever you have a young driver next to you, and that is I fell asleep. I mean, I went out. And Tina was in the seat behind me in the minivan, and she fell asleep. And about 2 hours later, we woke up, and there was a sign that said, "Welcome to Champaign-Urbana," which meant that we were about an hour and a half off our plan. It cost us some money, and it cost us some time. And we finally got to Grandpa's house a little later than we thought. And then when you're driving, you can imagine you see two signs: detour ahead or take your usual route. Which one would you go for? Most of us would go for take your usual route, right? Because we know where we're going, we know where we're heading, we know how it's, know how it's going to end up. But imagine that detour ahead is not about driving, but rather your life. Imagine if something comes into your life that says detour ahead or take your usual route. What will you choose? Now, some detours ahead you have absolutely no control of. You have an unexpected surgery, and that's a thing. Or you have a spouse that leaves you. Or you have a sickness of a family member, or a financial collapse, and you don't know, those things you can't control. But imagine the detour ahead has that option of take your usual route. Because there's times when we have a choice. We can take the detour, or we can take the usual route. Well, either one, we can make a choice. And so today we're going to look at a person in the Bible, a story that Jesus tells about a guy who takes the detour. And he doesn't take the usual route. He goes in a different direction. Now, the story we're going to look at is a very familiar story. We've already looked at one of the parables of Jesus that is most likely, the one that you've all heard about, the story of the prodigal son. We looked at that, 2 ways to be lost. You could be lost through your goodness, or you could be lost through your badness. We saw that, right? This time we're going to be looking at the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, you probably have heard of him, right? So let's go look there. We're going to look at Luke chapter 10. We're going to start with verse 25 if you want to follow along with me. And I want you to picture, as we're looking at, look for the motive of this guy who's asking Jesus a question, okay? And behold, a lawyer stood up to him to test him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, this is Jesus, "You've answered correctly. Do this, and you shall live." Now, Jesus encounters this lawyer, or this expert in the law. Now, lawyers back then didn't have quite the esteem that they have today. You've heard about the story about what's the one lawyer who's at the bottom of the sea just to start, right? that kind of. But back then, the lawyers were very much looked up to. They had a special job to do. They were ones who did 3 jobs. One was that they had to interpret the law of Moses, the Torah. Secondly, they were to tell other people how to live according to the law of Moses. And then he was also to help people understand the great men and women of the Old Testament. That was their job. Now, did you catch the motive? What was the motive of this guy? He begins with teacher, rabbi, esteeming Jesus, but then it says, he questioned him in order to, what? Test him. He's asking the teacher to take a test. And he's trying to trap Jesus. And Jesus answers him rather than telling him, and he answers the question with a question. Don't you love those people? Okay. He answers the question. He says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And the lawyer, he can't even hold back. He didn't really push it to Jesus. Rather, he wanted to give his theological expertise. Now, it wasn't a very difficult one because he quotes the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And then he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds like a good answer, right? That's the same answer that Jesus gives. What is the greatest commandment? Love God, love people. That's it. That's what's important. Now, we've been talking a lot about what it means to follow Jesus, and we've been focusing on our relationship with God primarily. Right? We've been looking at repentance. We've been looking at things that have to do with our relationship with God, putting everything before Jesus. If you don't put everything, you cannot be my disciple. So he says, so he does this, and he answers it correctly. He gets an A+ answer for this. And it's A+ answer. Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you shall what? Live. That's what he says to him. And he's excited about it. But this guy has a question for Jesus. Another question. I want you to see the motive once again. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? He's trying to justify himself. Because, see, the neighbor for most Jews at this time, you had to have 2 things to be a neighbor. You had to have the same race and the same beliefs. That's what made you a neighbor. You had to have the same race and the same religion. So Jews could be a neighbor to a Jew. But outsiders, the Gentiles, you just didn't do that. If someone had a different belief than you didn't have to love them. And they live in a divided society then. Do we live in a divided society today? Yeah. I mean, yeah. So we the love across Jesus. For them it would be, well, they have to look like me, and they have to think like me, and then I'll love them. And sometimes we have that same attitude. This motive was to justify himself, to give himself an excuse. W.C. Fields said this. He was found reading his Bible on his deathbed, and he was asked, "Well, what are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm looking for loopholes." I think sometimes that's what we try to do. We try to justify ourselves, looking for some excuse. Now, here Jesus begins to tell the story. Now, this isn't just the lawyer's problem. This is our problem. Are we going to make excuses? We've looked at so far at our relationship with God the last few weeks, the relationship with Jesus. Now, how does that impact being a disciple of Jesus to go and do what Jesus says with one another? Verse 30. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, just looking at that right there is that here's a guy, he's coming down, he has money in his pockets. He has his little money bag. He's wearing his fine clothes. He's walking from Jerusalem, which is up higher, going north to Jericho, and it's the most dangerous road in the world. There's all kinds of little crevices where robbers can hide. And these robbers come out and they steal from him. They take everything. They take his clothes, because clothes were worth a lot. Most people only had one change, so boy, you could sell some clothes. So they take his clothes. They take his money. They beat him up. And usually they would beat him up to the point that they died. So here he is, lying naked against the road. He's out unconscious. He doesn't know what's going on at all. Verse 31, and now by chance a priest was going down the road, and he saw him pass by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place, saw the man pass by on the other side. But the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to the place he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So we have this man, we have the robbers, we have this guy who's been beaten up, and then all of a sudden a priest shows up. The priest was a person who offered the sacrifices between human beings, between the Jews and God. That was their job. And he comes along, he's the preacher, and the preacher sees this guy laying there, thinking he's dead. Well, if I touch him, I'll be unclean and I won't be able to do the sacrifices. I can't do that. And then the youth minister comes by, the Levite. Actually more like the worship minister. And sometimes you get both in the same guy. And he comes by, and he sees him laying there. I can't touch him. Besides, I've got busy stuff. I've got things to do. And so he heads out. Now there's a third person comes by, and he's a Samaritan. Now, for you and I, we think of the Good Samaritan. Jewish people would have never think of a good Samaritan. They would always think of a bad Samaritan, because what happened was 700 years earlier, whenever Assyria came down and sacked Israel, they took 10,000 people, moved them out, and brought a bunch of people in, and the Jewish people who were there married into these families, and then they had what's called half-breeds. Remember the song by Cher, Cherokee People? Cherokee people! There we go. So proud to live, so proud to die. You know, half-breeds, that's all I ever heard, half-breeds. And that would be the same for the Samaritans. Toward the Jews to the Samaritans, they would call them half-breeds. You're not acceptable. You have tainted blood in you. I've been listening to stories about Nazi Germany in which Hitler was so against the Jews that he wanted to exterminate them. Same kind of thing. They really had no love lost between these two groups of people. They weren't the same race, and they didn't believe the same. These aren't neighbors. They're not people. And so by using the Samaritan as the hero, Jesus doesn't matter about who is your neighbor. Your race doesn't matter. What the other person thinks doesn't matter. See, today lots of people call themselves Christian. As a matter of fact, up to about 84% of people, if you ask them, what are you? They'll say Christian. Now, the largest group is called the nuns, and not the N-U-Ns, but rather the N-O-N-E-S, which means they have no religious background. But still, majority of people in America say they're Christians. But do the majority of people in America act like Christ? Do they act like disciples of Christ? Well, this is where the problem is. So let's go on verse 33, what happened. Verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he was journeying, came where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. Compassion that moves to what? Talked about it a few weeks ago. Compassion that moves you to action, right? So here's his action. And he went to him, and he bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he set on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, and he gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him. And whatever more you spend, I will repay you when you come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And then Jesus said, you go and do likewise. As people who are followers of Jesus Christ, we are to go and do what? Likewise. So the good Samaritan rather than like the lawyer, he doesn't make excuses. He goes and does. And so I want to look at some of the common excuses we use for not doing. For whenever a detour is offered to us or take the usual route, we are tempted always to take the usual route rather than take the detour. So the first one is taking the detour takes risk. The man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. That road is a very, very dangerous road. But the Samaritan was willing to take the risk. Imagine you're on this dangerous road, you need to get to the place where you're going, and it's scary. But what does he do? He stops anyhow. He stops anyhow. Now, sometimes we don't do things because there's a risk involved. Now, sometimes taking a risk is not just, sometimes it's stupid. Okay? Imagine you're going down the road by a prison, and it says, don't pick up any hitchhikers, and there's a hitchhiker out there in an orange jumpsuit going like this. Picking him up is probably not the wisest thing in the world, right? I mean, there may be other options, but picking him up is not a good idea. But sometimes we just won't do anything because of any type of risk. Sometimes we have to be willing to take a risk. I'm not saying put yourself in physical danger. I'm not necessarily. But there may be some other risks that you might need to take. Because sometimes loving somebody who's in need requires some things from you. Okay, let's look at some other things. Taking a risk takes involvement. Look at verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. Compassion that leads to action. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. So the Samaritan was willing to touch this guy who he maybe was dead. Was willing to go, hey, buddy, are you okay? And he saw his wounds, and what does he do? He takes out his wine and his oil. That was common medical treatment back then. Wine and oil, okay? That was what you did. And so he does that, and he cares for him. He pours that oil and pours that wine on it. And then a Samaritan doesn't use an excuse of not getting involved. Now, when Christians have been asked the question to take on fostering a drug addict baby, here's their reasoning for not doing it. Now listen to this. I will fall in love with that kid, and I'd have to give him away. And that would just be too hard for me. They use their love as an excuse not to do. See, I love too much, therefore I can't love at all. Isn't that a little crazy? We have to get ourselves dirty and get involved. Taking a detour also takes time. Look what he does in verse 34. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to the inn and took care of him. Do you think that took time? Absolutely, that would have taken time. The Samaritan was willing to use up his schedule, his plan, his agenda in order to help somebody else. Sometimes we use our schedules to justify not helping, not doing for other people. Right? Maxwell Gladwell writes in his book Tipping Point, he tells about this story about these two psychologists who were going to test some seminary students at Princeton Theological Seminary. And what he did was this. They set these seminarians up, and so they asked them, why did you get into the ministry? Why are you a seminarian? And some of them was, I just like to study theologies. Others says, I like to help people. And so what they did was he set up this deal, is that they would talk to them, and then they would have them go to another building on campus. And on their walk to the other campus, there was a guy there who was holed up in an alley, groaning and coughing and moaning. And the idea was to see who would help. So they gave a couple other variables. Besides answering the question about why you entered the ministry, they also asked them question. This is that they would give either a talk on the relevance of the professional ministry or do a little talk on the Good Samaritan. So they were to go over to this other building and give their little talk. And finally, what they were done was this. To some of them, they said, oh, yeah, by the way, you're going to be late, so you better get over there. And other ones, they told them, oh, you got a few minutes, but you probably need to head over there. And what happened was 10% of the people, 10% of the seminarians who were told, oh, you're going to be late, only 10% helped the man. 63% who were told, you've got a little time, helped the man. Everything else was the same. Whether they had done the Good Samaritan story or done the relevance of vocational ministry, either one, no, it didn't matter. What it was the schedule, was the time. Sometimes our time becomes the variable. And I know with me, that time issue, that crunch moment, I've got to get somewhere, I've got to do something, that keeps me often from doing the help that I've been asked. And sometimes I just don't want to hear the story. Just tell me what you need. Because you're going to lie to me anyhow. That's somewhat, times I have that feeling. When it comes to helping those in need, loving your neighbor, it's not our ability, but our availability. Are we available to those detours in life? The fourth excuse is taking a detour takes money. Verse 35, and on the next day he took 2 denarii, and he gave it to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. The Samaritan doesn't use money as an excuse. Yeah, sometimes we'll use this because it's going to affect our pocketbook. You know, the Samaritan is that he would take even the extra expenses. I'm going to come back. I'll come back later. And if you need more money, I'm going to do it. Now, 2 denarii, I know what that was, 2 days' pay. So take whatever your 2 days' pay is. That's what it would have cost him. Minimum. And so he's given 2 days' pay to this guy. Now, Margaret Thatcher said this once, no one would ever remember the Good Samaritan if he only had good intentions. He had money as well. If you're going to love your neighbor, don't use money as an excuse. Don't use time as an excuse. Don't use involvement as an excuse. Don't use risk as an excuse. Rather, engage yourself. Did Jesus answer the question, who is my neighbor? Yes, he did. Look at verse 36 and 37. Which one of these do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. Jesus changed the focus from who is my neighbor to what kind of neighbor am I? One of the things, we moved into Nevada and we have a neighbor, and he has reached out to us in so many different little ways. Lives right next door to us. He's a good neighbor, and he helps and takes care. I wish I was more like Scott next door. A good Samaritan disadvantaged himself in order to advantage someone else. Our spiritual journey calls beyond managing our to-do list, our bank account, our schedule. This week I want to challenge you. You got 2 choices. You got a detour ahead of you, or you got take the usual route. Why not take the detour? Just take it. You'll be blessed. Because Jesus says it's better to give than to receive. And you'll be blessed because of it. Do something, anything, to help somebody else. Decide to take a divine detour. Take action and love your neighbor. It's sort of a simple thing, isn't it? Usually it's not some big deal. You're usually not going to have some guy dead on the side of the road or half dead on the side of the road. It's going to be something simple, something easy, a little bit of help, a little bit of care, a little bit of love. Because see, if your relationship with Jesus doesn't impact your relationship with one another, guess what? You might not have that great of a relationship with Jesus. Because Jesus is the one who took the risk, right? He left heaven, left all that he had, and came to earth for you and me. Right. He gave up his everything for you and me. He took a risk. He got involved in the people's life. As a matter of fact, John tells us that he pitched his tent amongst us. He came into the neighborhood. He got involved. He risked his life. He took the time. Think about some of the conversations he had. He took the time to be with others. So let's just try that. Let's do that. I'm not sure Jesus had a lot of money, but he did leave the streets of gold, didn't he? So I guess he had quite a bit for you and for me. Jesus took the risk and died on the cross for you and me.